Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear students of the National University Odesa Academy. I have a privilege to introduce you the today's special guest of our University Odesa Academy, Mr. Martin Malek, who is an independent political analyst and who is dealing with post-Soviet region. Good afternoon, Mr. Malek.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Mr. Malek, on behalf of the president of our university, Professor Sergei Kivalov, I would like to express sincere gratitude for your time, efforts, dedication that you agreed to participate in this forum. You agreed to give lecture to our students. We highly appreciate it, and we hope that in the nearest future you will be able to visit Odesa, you'll be able to visit Odesa Academy and teach personally at our university. So you're always welcome, so please. And regarding the way we will going to act, I would like to say some remarks. First of all, we start with the lecture, Mr. Malek's lecture, which will be about, let's say, 35 minutes. And then questions, if the audience will have questions, they will be able to pose them to Mr. Malek. So please, Mr. Malek, thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katzin. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, again. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me, especially to Mr. Katzin, who raised the initiative to invite me for this lecture. And of course, to your academy, which gives me the possibility to address you today, which of course I do that with great pleasure, and it is a big honor for me. Yes, I would like to visit Odesa, which unfortunately I have so far not done. Now it's almost impossible due to the well-known circumstances, but we all hope that this nightmare soon will end so that we can meet in person. I was, as a topic of my presentation, I proposed European Union after the pandemic and during Putin's war, and this was appreciated by Mr. Katzin. And so I'm going to tell you something about this from my point of view. Of course, this is a very important disclaimer. Although I am formally the staff member of a state-run institution in Austria, I want to emphasize that all what I'm going to say is my personal opinion, my personal analysis, my personal approach. It is under no circumstances the official opinion of Austria, of the Republic, or the government, or the Ministry of Defense, or of any other organization or institution or ministry. It is only, so to speak, my fault. It means if you don't like it, don't blame Austria, blame only me, or tell me then which aspects of my presentation you did not like, or what you did not understand. So, as to the coronavirus pandemic, I think we can conclude this topic because most of the people, observers and decision makers, think that it is almost over, at least in Central Europe. Maybe it's otherwise in other parts of the world, but in Central Europe, most of the observers agree that it is over. But of course, it is possible that something will happen which compels us to return to certain kind of the coronavirus regime, which we had for 2.5 years. So the main topic of my presentation is, of course, the European Union and Putin's war. First of all, I want to emphasize that with the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, 30 years ago, the European Union established a so-called Common Foreign and Security Policy, or CFSP. And it was in the institutional framework of the European Union, it was placed alongside the so-called first pillar, meaning the European communities, as the second pillar, meaning the CFSP is the second pillar. And the third, last pillar, is the cooperation in the fields of justice and home affairs. And the objective of the Common Foreign and Security Policy was twofold. Firstly, the European Union was concerned to pool its common foreign policy interests in order to become a in order to become a more powerful player in international politics. Secondly, policy interests in order, especially in view of the European Union's eastwards enlargement, the fundamental values of the European Union were to be formulated as substantial goals of foreign policy. These are the preservation of peace and security and the strengthening of democracy, the rule of law, and human and fundamental rights. Decisions within the framework of this common foreign and security policy are taken unanimously by the member states. The role of the EU's supranational bodies is limited. Thus, the European Commission has no formal right to initiative, even though it can in fact take initiatives. The European Parliament has no decision-making rights in the common foreign and security policy. It only has to be informed. The common EU foreign policy is characterized by its approach of political dialogue and détente. However, the European Union has always found it difficult to reach a common position in crises, as the Kosovo crisis in 1999, the Iraq crisis, and others. And Russia's current war against Ukraine is unfortunately no exception. The European Union, as a matter of common knowledge, after the exit of the United Kingdom, has 27 members left. And most of them find it difficult to international issues. For example, at the beginning of June, when the European Union's sixth sanctions package against Russia was under discussion, Hungary insisted on exempting the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Putin confidant and war supporter Kirill, from the sanctions, and Hungary prevailed. Hungary achieved this goal. Kirill was removed from the sanctions list. However, as you might know, Hungary is not even an Orthodox country. The Orthodox countries in the EU, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, had not made this demand. And this makes it totally clear that this had nothing to do with religious issues. It was a pure political interest of Hungary, whose Prime Minister Viktor Orban is, well, he's not that Putin critical as most of the other heads of governments and states of the European member states are. And this eternal disunity of the European Union plays into the hands of the Kremlin, who of course knows it well and always tries to exploit it. And this has not started with 24th February this year. Just in one sentence, I can mention that Putin and his propagandists, secret services, and others have promoted and supported, this is so to speak Russian soft power, supported separatist movements in Western Europe Catalonia, Spain, Scotland, Britain, as well as the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, all to weaken the European Union. Well, the European Union tries to realize its foreign policy goals through association agreements with neighboring states, including Ukraine. And when Ukraine's then pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych in November 2013 refused to sign the long-negotiated association agreement with the European Union, he triggered the protest movement that entered history as Euromaidan, or Revolution of Dignity. And with that, the European Union, and in the context of events in and around Ukraine, faced challenges in a realm in which the European Union, until then, was hardly active. Thus, the well-known German media outlet Der Spiegel, or Mirror in English, then, I mean in 2013, wrote, Brussels and its junior partners, meaning in the framework of the EU's Eastern Partnership, were discussing steel tariffs, wheat exports, and the purchase of Eastern European wine. When such ties suddenly became an issue of geopolitics, the West was shocked, unquote. And geopolitics is something in which Vladimir Putin's Kremlin has always totally felt at home. Moreover, geopolitics determines Putin's view of the world. But the European Union was always very anxious not to, so to speak, quarrel with Putin's increasingly assertive Russia only, so to speak, because of seemingly, at least in comparison with other international problems, as then the consequences of the financial crisis, Iran's nuclear program, or the civil war in Syria, so to speak, unimportant Ukraine. Unimportant, of course, again, so to speak, because Ukraine is not unimportant. At least I have always known that this is, well, due to its geopolitical location and due to many other reasons, one of the crucial countries in the world. But many European Union politicians seem to think that Ukraine is not worth to take it as a reason for contradictions with Russia. This approach of many European Union politicians has several reasons. Thus, Brussels' traditional Russia first policy towards the post-Soviet space. Do you understand what I mean with Russia first? Russia first policy with respect to the post-Soviet space means that for Brussels and the European Union and NATO, by the way, too, Russia is, so to speak, above all and much more important than all the other former Soviet republics. And that is especially important to accommodate Russia, even at the expense of the just interests of other former Soviet republics, with Ukraine among them, not to mention smaller republics, as, I don't know, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, or whatsoever. And yes, and in her first keynote speech as the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the Christian Democratic politician from Germany, has stated in November 2009 Europeans want to hold our own in the world. Europe must also learn the language of power. This means, for one thing, building up our muscles where we have long been able to lean on others in security policy, for example. And these others, of course, meant NATO and its leading power, the United States. Well, what Mrs. von der Leyen then said sounds, of course, very good in theory, but I suspect that if Mr. Putin took called the weaknesses of the EU's policy as perceived by Putin. It's just about that. For the Kremlin, there's only one scale for evaluating political power relations, which is limited by the extremes of strong and weak. He determines it primarily, if not exclusively, by the possibility and the political will of countries and alliances to use military force. And what does Putin think of actors in world politics who see that differently? According to Donald Tusk, Prime Minister of Poland from 2007 to 2014, and then President of the EU's European Council until 2019, who knew Putin, of course, personally, the latter, quote, feels something like contempt for a political civilization in which naked force is not the only criterion, unquote. And the European Union can no more cope with this than the US, which seem to be in a state of global political decline. For Putin and his adepts, in and outside of Russia, the question of, as he guesses, who will rule the world will be decided exclusively on the geopolitical chessboard, so to speak, on which he sees the European Union as a pawn, which is, as everybody knows, the weakest piece in chess. Putin has assigned to the European Union the role of a politically insignificant satellite. In its capacity as investor, lender, and customer of Russian energy resources, Putin, at least until February 2002, the European Union, which he only allowed to provide capital to, firstly, finance the life of the Moscow kleptocracy, which is always greedy for new palaces and other luxury real estate, yachts, etc., and secondly, modernize the Russian military. And this has been done for many, many years. Of course, it must not be concealed here that many, many corrupt politicians, functionaries, managers, businessmen, and others in the European Union have made excellent money, not only, but especially from the business with Russian energy resources. Several European Union countries were deliberately steered into dependency on these energy sources. In my home country, Austria, it reached up to 80% for natural gas, and we have to somehow find other suppliers. But this is not that simple. But this is another discussion. If you're interested in this aspect of the issue, we can discuss it later, and because it's very important. But I have to continue with other topics. In Russia, admitting a mistake is generally considered as a weakness. Mr. Putin has not invented this behavior, but took it to its political extreme. From his point of view, international law and other rules are also something that small and weak actors in international relations, for example, Austria, have to comply with, but not the, as he thinks, big and strong Russia that gets off its knees. Putin has broken countless international and bilateral rules, agreements, and treaties, the United Nations Charter, the Budapest Memorandum with security guarantees for Ukraine from 94, the Russian-Ukrainian Friendship Treaty of 97, Commonwealth of Independent States and United Nations documents on the prohibition of forcible border changes, and many, many others. Putin also thought that he was showing toughness by summarily ignoring the 1 million, ladies and gentlemen, coronavirus death reached, according to unofficial figures, in Russia in December 21, and instead had the big war against Ukraine prepared. From Putin's point of view, the Russian proverb, victors are not put on trial, победителей не судят, always and everywhere applies. And so far, he has won all these wars. He has been waging wars literally since his first days as a prime minister in the summer of '99. Then in the breakaway North Caucasian Republic of Chechnya, in 2008 against Georgia, since 2014 Ukraine, since 2015 in Syria, in Libya, and other parts of Central Asia, where the Russian Military Intelligence Service, or GRU, operates, which disguises itself as the so-called private military company Wagner, and is strongly suspected of committing war crimes. Putin despises all those who are not prepared to take risks and fight wars to a victorious end. The United States and its NATO allies virtually fled Afghanistan in the summer of 21 after 20 years. 20 years. They had been unable to defeat the Islamist Taliban, a group of long-bearded and often illiterate fanatics who had hardly any heavy weapons and air defense and preferred to travel barefooted in pickups and on motorbikes. Thus, the United States, as Putin's Kremlin saw these events, was militarily much weaker than generally assumed and politically spineless, which is why the US may well bond on allies in order not to have to fight. Putin intended to take full advantage of this, with a large-scale attack on Ukraine. One, of course, can ask, why should Putin, from his specific point of view, of course, actually observe any rules of conduct in international relations when he was constantly rewarded by the European Union and the United States for breaking them? Russia was constantly showing up the European Union for many years, and Brussels took great pains not to notice. All this happened against the background of the fact that Russia has only a fraction of the economic potential of the European Union and the NATO countries. Putin nevertheless believes that he can, so to speak, redraw the map of Europe by military force. He could only have received this impression because he was firmly convinced of the geopolitical weakness of the West, or what he considers as West and the European Union in particular. Over many years, Putin and his envoys have obviously and unabashedly deceived their Western interlocutors many times, and they and the latter did not even want to notice this. Or did they only pretend as if, in order not to harm relations with Russia, not to let the threat of talks with Moscow break, as went a very well-known phrase. In any case, the statements, but even more so the actions of Western politicians and their countries in Moscow were interpreted to mean that they could lie and deceive with complete impunity, spread propaganda, fake news, and complete absurdities, such as, for example, the genocide of the Russian population in the Donbass, and that the Western representatives would always come back in order to conduct some kind of negotiations, in order to conclude agreements on whatsoever with Moscow. Putin, of course, often did not comply with them anyway. From his point of view, these agreements served to impose obligations on the other side, meaning European Union, NATO, US, whosoever, while he himself accepted none at all. And here, too, the Western countries and organizations pretended not to notice the Russian behavior in order not to, quote, not to poison the atmosphere, or not to burn bridges, or to keep negotiations options open, not to slam the doors to compromise, and whatever other phrases there were. And Putin often told his Western interlocutors exactly what they wanted to hear. Even and especially when he had the exact opposite in mind or was already planning to do so. For example, during the visit of the German Federal Chancellor, head of government of Germany, Olaf Scholz, to Moscow in mid-February 22, means a couple of days before the main attack on Ukraine started, Putin still assured that, quote, Russia, of course, does not want war, unquote. At the time, Putin, of course, had already made the decision to militarily break up Ukraine as a state. At the time, Scholz had still told Putin that, and I quote verbatim, security in Europe can only be achieved with and not against Russia, unquote. Illusions about Putin had prevailed in the European Union even after Putin's annexation of Crimea in March 2014. The European High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, the Spaniard Josep Borrell, has long maintained that, quote, tensions and disagreements must be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy, unquote. However, Mr. Borrell actually had personal experience of dialogue and diplomacy with Putin's Kremlin. In early February 2001, he, as well as, of course, the organization he represents, meaning the European Union, was effortlessly outplayed and humiliated by Putin's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov in Moscow. Borrell's explanation that Ukraine's accession to NATO was currently out of the question did not help either. This, of course, raised the question of why a European Union politician would make statements about membership in another organization, NATO, for which he is not responsible. In any case, this further advance by the West, or what the Kremlin considers as such, further strengthened Putin's appetite, and Borrell could not save himself from a reckoning by Lavrov. Lavrov called the European Union an unreliable partner at the joint press conference and criticized it for alleged lies regarding the poisoning of the well-known Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny in August 2020. Lavrov also used the opportunity to once again condemn European Union sanction policy because of Russia's annexation of Crimea. He called the sanctions unilateral and illegitimate restrictions and lectured Borrell that the European Union was resorting to methods from the colonial past. But the European Union has no colonial past. This is, of course, bizarre. But Borrell was visibly completely overwhelmed in this situation and unable to avert the political, diplomatic, and propaganda fiasco. In dealing with Chinese, Iranian, North Korean, Syrian, etc. representatives, Putin and Lavrov and all their friends, on the other hand, are always of exquisite politeness. In January 2022, it became completely obvious that the West, with the European Union and the European Union and the US, as its head, wants to appease Putin. The Russian troop deployment was almost completed then, but it was clear to attentive, critical, and historically aware observers that Putin, in the case of such an appeasement, will give the order of a full-blown attack on Ukraine, or has already done so. In Putin's eyes, Western policy made a complete fool of itself with statements such as Ukraine does not threaten Russia, as said by US President Joe Biden, as if this were not generally known, even and especially in the Kremlin. The Western mantra that this conflict has no military solution, claimed for all recent conflicts in Afghanistan or whatsoever, is already beginning to emerge in Western Europe regarding Putin's big war in Ukraine since February, is also an expression of massive weakness for the Kremlin to exploit. The well-known Polish politician Radzislaw Sikorski, the former foreign minister and defense minister of his country, accused Western European politicians a few days after the start of the big Russian invasion of Ukraine of not having understood for a long time that they were dealing with pinstripe-suited gangsters, I quote that literally, in Putin's Russia. These politicians, I quote Sikorski, thought that they were already in Kant's internal peace. They have started to believe their own propaganda that war is unthinkable and problems cannot be solved militarily. But when you speak and think like that, the other side makes the decisions for you. And that is exactly what is happening, unquote. Putin always considered popular slogans in Western Europe and North America, such as, these are quotations, of course, "We must build bridges to Russia. We must keep the channels of communication with Moscow open. We must not let the thread of talks break. We are ready to talk. We must return to the negotiation table and dialogue. To be manifestations of weakness." Other phrases very popular in Western Europe were, "We must make Putin offers he cannot refuse. We must avoid Putin losing face. We must not push Putin into the corner." The situation is more complex than it seems at the first glance. It takes two to wage war, as it does to rape. This is my comment, etc., etc. And this was precisely this Western appeasement that contributed massively to bringing about the current situation in the first place. I want to remind some of arguments with which many in Western Europe, politicians, political scientists, journalists denied until 21st of February that there could be a large-scale Russian attack on Ukraine. Quote, "I cannot imagine that. And that would be far too expensive for Russia and all of us." Unquote. Of course, you can laugh about that, although it's not really laughable, it's more tragicomical. Moreover, such statements are, of course, not really politics and certainly not political science, but exclusively emotional. Maybe many Ukrainians will even find that hard to believe. But such claims are used in Western Europe to make and or to justify policy towards Ukraine and Russia. But in Poland, the Baltic states, and Scandinavia, there were always far fewer or no illusions about Russia, which means that, I hope you understand what I mean, that the main problem is Western Europe, and especially Germany and France. Such assessments of Western European decision makers testify to a total ignorance of Russia and specifically of Putin, although there has been 22 years to get to know him, and his willingness, indeed his active will, to wage wars. For he has demonstrated this literally since the first day of his rule in Chechnya, which I have already mentioned. Well, I have, I think, only 10 or 15 minutes left. Therefore, I want to familiarize you with at least some features of discussions about the current war and about Russia, which are now conducted in the West, and especially, but of course not only, among political scientists and historians and other social scientists. One discussion is, for example, about the question whether Russia is a fascist state, or whether it had become a fascist state since February, or whether it could become a fascist state yet. There is, of course, very controversial discussion about that. The well-known American historian and public intellectual Timothy Snyder says, yes, Russia is a fascist state. This was, by the way, his opinion already before Putin's big attack on Ukraine. Others say, no, he is not fascist, and Snyder cannot be trusted because he's too pro-Ukrainian. This controversy will undoubtedly continue for a long time, and it is not expected to lead to clear results soon. Unfortunately, I have no time to go into details, but at least I want to tell you about this type of discourse. I want to briefly discuss some people, I mean, important intellectuals, scientists from Western Europe and Northern America, but one is from Australia, but he works in Britain, who are on one hand very, very important, very influential, and on the other hand hold very specific views on Ukraine and Russia. First of all, I want to mention the American political scientist John Mearsheimer, who works for many years at the Chicago University, a very, very well-known university, and Mr. Mearsheimer is really heard all over the world. He's a representative of the theory of realism in international relations. But you can look on his presentations on YouTube and other sources in the internet. You can read his publications. This is very simple. Everything is there. But already in 2007, when he published a research called The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy, some critics said that Mr. Mearsheimer is spreading conspiracy theories. Yes, and that was not only with respect to Middle East policy of the US. This was especially on what he called, and others, the Ukrainian crisis. These people hardly speak about Russia's war against Ukraine. They like to say the Ukrainian crisis, or the Ukrainian-Russian war, or war between Ukraine and Russia, not mentioning what this stuff is really about. And it is basically Russia's attack on Ukraine and nothing else. Yes, in September of 2013, a couple of months after Putin's annexation of Crimea, Mr. Mearsheimer wrote in that article, "Why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault, liberal delusions that provoked Putin." I think that goes without saying what that meant. And after the start of Russia's full-fledged war against Ukraine in 2002, Mr. Mearsheimer did not change his opinion. He reiterated his belief that NATO and the European Union were largely to blame for this. And therefore, it was not that astonishing that the Security Service of Ukraine placed Mearsheimer on a list of public figures whom it alleges promote Russian propaganda. Just a moment, please. Then, in this context, it is impossible not to mention the German political scientist Johannes Farwig, who constantly sits in German talk shows, constantly gives interviews, writes a lot of stuff. I have no time to get into details, but I want to quote only one stuff he said. It is unfortunately in German, but if somebody of you knows German, you can read this on your own. This is reading, but this is of course Mr. Farwig, and he says here, the Ukraine is sowieso verloren, translating as Ukraine is lost anyway. This is the opinion of Mr. Warwick, very important man in his field. And needless to say that Mr. Warwick is categorically opposed to Western armaments deliveries to Ukraine. Another interesting case in this context is Mr. Edward Luttwak. Luttwak is a Romanian-born US political scientist and historian who is considered by many to be a strategy expert. Well, he's very old, one could say maybe his best times have long gone. Yes, certainly. In the case of Mr. Luttwak, the best times are gone and they will not return anytime soon. Because this, again, very influential voice proposed to conduct referendums in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. And he says that this is democratically justified because the people should decide to which country they should belong. Yes, this is no joke. This is no joke. For him, it is the only possibility to solve the crisis. Of course, if one makes such proposals, he makes it totally clear that he has no idea on Putin, on Russia, on Ukraine whatsoever. He makes it totally clear that he's not aware of Ukraine's constitution, which does not provide to such referendums. There is no provision in Ukraine's constitution saying that it is possible that, I don't know, Khersonska Oblast determines whether it wants to belong to Russia or to Ukraine. Moreover, under the circumstances of a Russian occupation. And this idea of Mr. Luttwak is, of course, bizarre and ridiculous. But there are other people making similar statements. Of course, I cannot discuss them all. This would lead too far. but let's take another one. Another very well-known researcher, Mr. Christopher Clark, who he is Australian, but he's I think in Cambridge University, meaning in elite university. And of course, the people from Cambridge University are very expected, and their opinions are very well noticed in the world. And he said, for example, in March 2014, quote, Crimea Peninsula is a place that has a very special significance for Russia, a region that has a very sensitive and important significance for Russia. Yes, he said it, verbatim translated. And you can't ignore that, unquote. He said that European Union is partially to blame for the crisis because it had not talked to Russia on which terms Ukraine could associate with the European Union, as if Ukrainian association is a matter of a third country, which is again quite strange. But nevertheless, Mr. Clark said other strange phrases. For example, I quote, "The situation is complex." That said a Cambridge scholar. Or, quote, "Russia still belongs to Europe," unquote. So you see, very prominent people give analysis and advice which demonstrate their complete ignorance of Ukraine and Russia, and which cannot be described as anything other than dangerous. Because these people are very influential, they constantly appear in the media, advise politicians who, these politicians, in turn make decisions that also and especially affect Ukraine badly and Russia well. Warwick and Clark and all these other guys with similar views are constantly sitting on talk shows, giving interviews to domestic and foreign media, are present on YouTube, and thus reach many millions of people, and of whom, in turn, may say to themselves, quote, "Yes, if he wasn't so wise, he wouldn't have become a professor after all. So he's right," unquote. Unfortunately, this is how the mechanisms of opinion making work for many media consumers, and even for a lot of social scientists as well. Well, I come to my conclusions. The first conclusion is that the European Union will either also become a geopolitical player, especially vis-à-vis Russia and China, or, if not, it will drastically lose importance and influence in the world, including in Europe itself. One can illustrate this, for instance, in the Western Balkans, where Russia and China have been trying for many years to gain influence and to displace the European Union. These two authoritarian great powers can rely especially on Serbia and the so-called Serbian Republic in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The sad truth, which some in Western Europe stubbornly refuse to see even now, is all initiatives for so-called cooperation with Russia have helped Putin to make the decision to launch a major attack on Ukraine easier. It is decidedly not polemic, but a hard reality. Ukraine is currently being reduced to rubble by the Russian dialogue partners of the West and the European Union. I like to wrap up my presentation with a quotation of the political scientist Anton Chekhovtsov, who is from Crimea, by the way, but he's ethnic Russian, and who lives in Vienna now, made in June 2021, quote, "Putin's Russia is not simply uninterested in dialogue with Europe, meaning the European Union. The Kremlin believes that the European Union does not deserve dialogue with Russia. The European Union, however, has seen from behind the Kremlin's parapets, is no global player. Putin's Russia does not define itself in relation to the European Union. The European Union is considered weak, indecisive, and on the verge of collapse, a development that Moscow is happily trying to advance through support of anti-EU parties," unquote. Thank you for your attention. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much, Mr. Malek, for this substantial presentation. Unfortunately, we are running out of time and we don't have time for let's say QA session. I mean, thank you very much for your time, for your efforts again. Dear colleagues, dear students, thank you for attending Mr. Malek's lecture, and I hope in the future Mr. Malek will be eager to continue these lectures to you and to participate in events organized by the Civil Academy. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a productive day again. Thank you very much, Mr. Malek, for your interesting lecture and for your support which you expressed to Ukraine in its resisting against Russian aggression and Russian invasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.